Hi, my name is Barbie Enrico, and I'm here to welcome you to Pitch Tips Zoomcast, and where venture capitalist Fred Haney gives feedback to CEOs of startup companies to help them raise capital. Fred is an experienced venture capital fund manager, angel investor, entrepreneur, founder Monday Club, and author of The Fundable Startup, one of the best selling books about startup companies getting funded. So let's find out what Fred has to say to today's CEO.
Hi, and welcome to the Pitch Tips Zoomcast, a recorded program in which I, a venture capitalist, that would be me, Fred Haney, has a conversation with an entrepreneur about his startup idea. And the whole point is to let you be a fly on the wall in a conversation between a venture capitalist and an entrepreneur. Our intention here is to help the entrepreneur focus his message and say it in a way that communicates very clearly with potential investors. We're doing a series of these. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and come back. We'll be posting one every week or so. Thanks very much for joining us. Our guest today is Ken Eppens, and I'm going to let Ken tell you a little about his business before we jump into the Q&A. Ken, tell us about your project and maybe a little about how you got involved in your background.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity, Fred. Again, my name's Ken Eppens. I'm the founder and CEO of Orbit Guardians. And our mission is to eliminate space debris, to safeguard humanity's orbital infrastructure by leveraging $62 million for a spacecraft flight test and to generate $3 billion revenue in 7 years. I started this project unbeknownst to myself 33 years ago when I was a young engineer at an aerospace company who made window seals for the space shuttle. And on occasion, NASA would send those windows back to the fabricator, which was us, and let us see how our materials were withstanding the space environment. One of those windows came back, and these windows are 2 inches thick, and one came back with a very large crack in it where there was a piece of, we think it was paint that had embedded itself about 3/4 of an inch into the glass. And while we didn't have a solution for that, that always stuck in my mind. And here I am 33 years later, starting my own company to try and resolve the space debris issue because I refuse to buy the old paper-based Thomas Guide maps.
Well, you're obviously attacking an incredibly big problem, and I'm sure that'll be part of our conversation. Wow, it's an extremely ambitious project. Let's walk through it in a little more detail. Tell us a little more about your plans and any issues that you see that you have to work through, and we'll see if we can help focus the message and identify some key issues to help you improve your chances of getting funded.
Perfect. So again, our mission is to eliminate space debris, to safeguard humanity's orbital infrastructure. Why? Because the forecasted $3 trillion global space economy is already at risk. In the next 8 years, the United States is going to deploy 17 times the missions that the world has deployed in the last 60 years, according to statistics from the Air Force, NASA, and the FCC. And according to NASA, there are already 100 million debris objects orbiting Earth. Yes, 100 million. Do you see the problem yet? That's right, it's getting crowded, dangerous, and risky up there. So how are investors going to react when space-based objects start colliding more frequently? especially since no debris objects have yet to undergo active debris removal. Think of all the benefits enabled by space-based technologies, things like navigation, communication, banking, weather, farming, and a plethora of other space-based services that are on internet-connected devices, helping advance national security and economic prosperity. So eliminating space debris is important because a marble-sized object has the kinetic energy of a grenade. Now imagine a grenade going off in your refrigerator or hitting a satellite, creating more debris, creating more collisions and more debris and more collisions until we render low Earth orbit impossibly hostile. This is Orbit Guardian's opportunity. Our solution is to deploy a fleet of spacecraft that can deorbit hundreds of debris objects per launch, which overcomes the high cost associated with our competitors' one up, one down approaches. We're also working on a funding mechanism, and upon its legislative approval, enables private investors to take advantage of incentivized tax credits to help fund deorbit missions. One of our market opportunities is based on small debris. We're forecasting orders to deorbit 50,000 objects at $60,000 per deorbit and generating $3 billion in revenue with a profit of $1 billion in 7 years. Discussions with the White House, the Department of Commerce, Space Force, and satellite operators are going well, and NASA discussions are just beginning. We need $62 million. That's $60 million for our spacecraft flight test and $2 million to push tax credit legislation up Capitol Hill, what we're calling the Space Debris Act of 2021. Is Orbit Guardians the kind of company in which you would consider investing? What are the next steps in your process?
Good statement of what you're trying to do. Kind of the obvious question is, wow, this is just a huge project. And I'm guessing that there's not really a way to break it down into little steps. I mean, one of the strategies for startups is we'll go out and get a customer, develop your product, prove what you can do, bootstrap yourself. Do you have that option here, or is this kind of an all or nothing thing? You just need 62 million bucks, and nothing short of that helps.
So the $62 million is for our testing. So we plan to take care of all the research and development, the build of the spacecraft, the launching, taking it into space, and testing it on actual debris. So some of our competitors right now are taking debris with them and trying to deorbit those homegrown objects, I guess is the best word for it. We're actually identifying 40 objects that were errantly or put in space by Roscosmos, which is the Russian space organization. And they're in a nice tight belt. And we think that with a CubeSat size spacecraft that we can capture 40 of those and deorbit those into the atmosphere. As far as breaking this down, I've been doing this, I've been in the space field for 33 years. I started as a young engineer, and everything I've been doing in my career has led me to this point. I've learned about product development. I have learned about all the different requirements for space vehicles. I've learned about how the funding mechanism works. And right now, we've been looking for 2 years on how to get this funded. Fred introduced me to the Fundable Startup book, and in there was the idea of approaching grantors for funding to get the venture started. And in everybody that we talked to nobody has the initiative to deorbit space debris. Yet, it is one of the largest problems that I can see for our national economic prosperity.
Let's talk about the problem for a minute. Um, you know, you can sort of step back in your perspective. You talk about the number of objects out there and the danger, that kind of thing. Um, who's lying awake at 2 o'clock in the morning worrying about that?
That would be the Department of Defense, who is worried about national security. They use satellites to keep an eye on the battlefield, to keep an eye on weather, for communications. Another group that would be concerned about that would be the Department of Commerce, because there are a ton of services that utilize space-based satellites. And also, the Department of Defense is right now considering the idea of leveraging commercial satellites for some of their some of the missions that they have satellites for today that are billions and billions of dollars. So, for instance, communications through their own satellites. They're thinking about relying on commercial operators, which transfers some of the responsibility now to the commercial side of the industry. So satellite operators are going to be taking more burden, and making sure that their satellites don't get hit with debris is important to them.
I could see satellite launching companies like one I know of is Viasat, I guess. But seems I like your answer. It seems like DoD is kind of the obvious customer here in a sense. I mean, they're the ones who should probably worry about it the most. From their point of view, $62 million is like peanuts. I mean, is there any opportunity to get some grant funding through the DoD?
So we've tried many different agencies. So we have tried NASA, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the National Science Foundation, which we're still in the running for a possible grant there. And we've recently submitted and got approved for a grant through the Space Force, yet there's no funding available for that yet. So we're still on the hook for Space Force and the National Science Foundation.
Why wouldn't the DoD have already done something about this? I mean, I would think it would be kind of high on their list of things to worry about.
It has, space debris is something that they're very concerned about. As a matter of fact, starting in 2015, the Department of Defense has spent $6 billion on what's called space situational awareness. These are the radars that look into space and try and track debris in space. And it's geared to find debris that is smaller, and it's supposed to be more accurate. But still to this day, while they say it's operational, the data is still not available to satellite operators or organizations that are interested in space traffic management.
But the other, another avenue that occurs to me is that there's been a lot of movement in the last years toward sort of commercial partnership, NASA partnering with commercial entities to get things done. And the two names that come to mind there may be others that I don't know about, but the two that I think of are Boeing and Elon Musk. And now I guess Jeff Bezos maybe. Have you tried contacting those folks?
We have reached out to several launch companies and satellite operators. And just recently, we've been on a campaign working with the White House, talking to the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And Sam Jones over there has been connecting us with emails of generals in the Space Force and also with mission directors or mission strategy over at NASA. So we're starting to get some inroads, but as slow as those organizations work, I think it's going to take a lot longer to actually get funding. I mean, I've been looking at this for 33 years. This has been going on for much longer than that. And we need to get rolling on this because, like I said early in the very beginning of this, in the next 8 years, we're going to deploy, the United States is going to deploy 17 times the number of missions than the world has deployed in the last 60 years. So it's going to get crowded up there in a hurry.
Wow. Ken, you talked about needing $62 million to do your initial test. Can you describe what the company would look like, what the business model is? Suppose you got the 62 million, now what? I mean, 10 or 15 years from now, what does the company look like? How is it generating revenue? How's it generating profit? If I'm an investor, what can you tell me about how I'm going to get a return back on my investment? You know, when's that going to happen? How's that going to happen? What are the numbers going to look like?
Right. Good question. So I think at this point we've exhausted our SBIR grants program. I mean, we're going to continue to look for that funding, but I think we're focused more on a legislative bill that would go through Congress that would help enable tax credits so that private investors as well as satellite operators could use the tax advantages proposed by this bill to make money available for the industry to deorbit debris. So we haven't hired a team yet. My team is very small at this point. So I'm working with Sean Nolan, who I've slated him as the Chief Operations Officer. He is very good at complex operations, complex problems. He and I have worked at a previous company years and years ago, and he continues to amaze me on the things that he does. He's got a couple patents out there, and he remains one of my top guys right now. And then there's Sam Dupree, who he's been in the satellite or space industry for 39 plus years. And he's been predominantly working in classified programs. He's an astrodynamicist, and he and I have been working to actually identify our first mission, which is the Russian satellites that have deposited nuclear fuel coolant into the space debris, into the space environment. So this is now considered debris. And we've identified this mission because it's not all over the globe. It's in a nice tight belt. And Sam is very confident that with a small spacecraft that we can go deorbit those debris objects. I'm also working with Mike, who is currently employed with somebody else right now, but I've got his commitment. He's been in the industry, he's been working in space and sensors and circuit design for 13 years, and he's currently working on his PhD. That should be just about over by now. He lives in Texas, and I'm eager to get him on, back on the team and geared for what we're trying to do. So what we're trying to get to is to get some of this R&D funding out of the way to prove the feasibility of our spacecraft, as well as get the bill through, at least started in the House this year and ultimately across the president's desk, so that we can start with the ground testing, all the satellite testing that we can do here on Earth, and then ultimately start the test in space shortly after that. The return on investment would actually come after that, when we have demonstrated the capability of our spacecraft, and then orders start coming after we hire a marketing and sales team to go out and start capturing orders.
Usually the return on an investment comes kind of at the tail end when you reach, well, not the tail end, but when you reached a point that you could sell a company to a larger buyer or take it public. I would think this might be an initial public offering candidate at some point, but it's kind of difficult to pay off investors out of revenue. That doesn't very often happen.
Yeah, like I said in my introduction, so there are 100 million debris objects up there. So we have plenty of work to do. And I also said that we're focusing on small space debris. So there's, according to NASA, there's about 500,000 of those objects up there. So we still have plenty of work to do. And at 50,000 debris objects, at $60,000 per deorbit, that price is really, really small compared to some of our competitors. Our competitors, basically they launch a satellite up into space, rendezvous with a debris object, and then force it down into the atmosphere. And that typically is going to cost somewhere on the order of 125, 150 million, 250 million, depending on the size of the debris object. If it's the size of a school bus, it could cost billions of dollars. And we're focusing specifically on small space debris to prove the technology, to take some of the complexity and some of the risk out of the solution. And once we prove that out, I'm pretty confident that we'll have orders pretty much knocking on our door.
If you had the $62 million, break it down a little bit into some steps and milestones. You know, what would you do first quarter, second quarter, third quarter?
Okay, so the funding of $62 million, 60 million of that we're going to slate for R&D and building the spacecraft. So we have a couple components of the spacecraft that need to be designed and tested. We have some preliminary concepts. We just need to get into the lab and prove those out. And then once we call it the debris deorbit device, which is what actually causes the momentum transfer to the debris object, to cause it to slow down in a retrograde perspective, which causes the debris to lower in altitude and eventually deorbit into the atmosphere. So there's that side of it, the debris deorbit device. And then there's also the sensor side that would be on the front of the spacecraft to help us locate the debris object once we are in space. So we would have the space situational awareness folks, which is outside of our company. We would buy that service to help us get in the neighborhood. And once we get in the neighborhood, then we would locate the debris object using our sensors, which again has to be tested and proved out on ground first. And then approach the debris object using what they call a rendezvous proximity operation, and then do a momentum transfer and cause it to deorbit.
So if you had the 60 million bucks, how long would it take until you completed your R&D and your test?
So we're looking at about a year for that. We've actually been working with a provider of CubeSat technology that has what they call a bus, and all we would have to do is take our payload, design our payload to fit into their bus, and then they would launch it for us and operate it for us.
So here's an issue, we touched on it, but let's come back to it for just a minute. It seems to me you could make an argument that the government's responsibility is to keep us all safe, including from space stuff. So in a way, what this would be the government contracting with a private security firm, space security firm, to help clean up that problem. Is that a fair model for what would be happening here?
I think that's a fairly decent approach. Although one of the things that we've recognized in our research is that, there's this mentality called the big sky syndrome, which in the early days of the space program, we launched rockets and various satellites into space. And instead of doing what we all learn as kids and military personnel about cleaning up after yourself, the space program didn't clean up after themselves. They didn't finish the mission. So I don't think that they have the environment of space totally in the right mindset yet, but that's been changing. There's been a term called the Kessler Syndrome, which people are starting to adopt and take advantage, starting to realize that, what, we can't just create trash like we do as humans in our everyday life. We create trash where we are and where we're going every day. And, these companies that are starting to be affected by debris collisions are starting to recognize that we need to take better care of our environment. So the government, back in 2010, here's an interesting point. So back in 2010, the Obama administration passed a law through Congress that mandated NASA to work with other federal agencies to either develop or acquire technologies to help with space debris remediation or active debris removal. So once that program came about, funding was made available through NASA, and a few months into the program, after teams were already spending money on developing proposals, the program was shut down. Now, I've heard through the grapevine that was a decision made by the Pentagon. I don't know if that's truly the case, but that's what I'm hearing. So since 2010, 2011, there's been no spending on space debris. And I think that's why we need somebody like Orbit Guardians to come in and to push that ball up the hill.
Is the Space Force sort of a new opportunity for you? I mean, you've been talking to them, you said, but maybe they're the new guys who would address that.
Yeah, so Space Force came out of Air Force. Air Force has been managing a catalog of objects in space. I hear that is supposed to be transferring over to Space Force, and then Space Force is going to release that information to the Department of Commerce, who is going to then make it available for space operators throughout the world. So Space Force, I think, is going to have a valuable presence in the space situational awareness. And then Department of Commerce is going to be more focused on space traffic management, kind of the directors, the traffic cops, if you will. We're still talking with Space Force at this point, understanding what their roles and responsibility is going to be regarding space debris or the removal of space debris. Regardless, I think no matter which federal agency winds up with that responsibility, we're going to be there to help with this situation, with this problem.
So, Ken, is there any possibility that philanthropy could be a source of capital for you here?
Absolutely, Fred. One of the things that we're looking at with this tax credit legislation is to be able for contributors to receive tax advantages. For every dollar they spend, they would receive $1 of tax credit. And actually, for the first 2 or 3, we're thinking 2 years right now, for the first 2 years, that they would get a 2-for-1. So if you spend $1 to help us deorbit debris, that you get a $2 tax advantage. I can get into all the details of that, but this would be something that could be used for, mom and pop, family and friends. It could be used by philanthropists, private investors, as well as satellite operators. So I look forward to getting this through Congress as quick as possible.
Great. Well, that would be a good avenue for you. Like I said, you got to try everything. Well, look, we should wrap up. It's a fascinating challenge. It's ambitious and huge challenge. I know you know that. Let me just wrap up with a couple thoughts. You're certainly not in the pattern of the traditional venture capital deal or angel investment where 2 million, 5 million, $10 million sort of gets you going off and running, and you can go out and get customers and prove yourself and then scale up the business. It's not that kind of thing. You're more in the mold maybe of some of the early venture capital kinds of deals where it took a large amount of money to build a semiconductor factory or something like that. You know, there was just no bootstrapping path. That's not to say that no venture capital firm would want to do it. There's a lot of money in the venture capital industry right now, and somebody might spring for such a big and ambitious idea. I wouldn't say it's at all beyond the realm of possibility, but to get their attention, I do think you're going to have to describe your longer term business model, what the company would look like financially. You know, what do your spreadsheets look like? It's probably a long-term project, not just 5 years, but maybe 10 years from now. And what are the prospects for taking the company public so that investors could get their money back? I think it's an enormous opportunity. There's no question about that. The other thing that strikes me is that, and here's something that's kind of true of just about any startup, you do what you have to do to find your funding. So and you're doing the right thing. So you go out and you talk to a gazillion people. You talk to these guys and these guys and these guys. In this case, part of the challenge, it's both challenge and opportunity that you have, I think, is that it's such a big problem and it involves such big players. You're talking about DOD and the government and NASA and you know, the intergalactic committees. And that's both a challenge and an opportunity, I think. I mean, I would think somewhere in there, there would be some grant funding possible or some kind of a contract possible. And you're doing the right thing. The bootstrapping you can do is kind of what you are doing. You're getting some people involved, you're building your team, you're establishing some credibility, you're creating some plans. I mean, that part you can do. And the more of that you do, I think the better your chances will be going forward. Does that make sense?
You're right, Fred. This is definitely not your typical startup opportunity. You know, space has always been exceedingly expensive. You're talking about, you know, typical missions are on the order of 250 million to $2 or $3 billion, and getting that kind of money, you know, unfortunately, I'm not Elon Musk. I didn't start a company like PayPal and, you know, roll out with $1 billion in my pocket to get something like this started. So I'm doing everything I can to scrap together some money, and starting with the smaller piece of the R&D up front for $60 million, and then also trying to get the $2 million to help identify opportunities to get crowdsourced funding available for private investors to get a tax credit where for every dollar that they invest in our company, they would get $1 tax credit. You know, you're not talking about R&D tax credits, which are typically, I think, around 15%, or you know, any other tax advantages. We want $1 for dollar tax credit, and that would be available not only for private mom and pop shops, but or families, but also for satellite operators to help incentivize the funding of this you know, opportunity to deorbit space debris and to help clean up the environment and keep all these space-based services that we use today. You know, this call that we're on right now relies on the technologies associated with space. We couldn't do this without the satellites. So we've got to have this. And, you know, I'm open. If anybody's got any ideas on how to get funding available, I'm all ears. We've done the calculations. We've calculated this out for 10 years, and we understand the costs associated with getting it started to all the profit that we're going to be seeing down the road. And, I'm excited about this.
I don't know Elon Musk, but he is just down the street from you.
He is.
So to speak.
And I need to go knock on.
I think you have to do that kind of thing. You have to do a lot of that. Another thing in your case that may help you would be to get to know some of the politicians. Talk to your representatives. Talk to the senators if you can get to them.
Yeah, actually, about a month and a half ago, we sent out packages to 15 members of Congress in the House and the Senate. And we are following up with phone calls as we speak, and we are gathering. So we found out that the way that it happens in Congress is these representatives have staff that help vet opportunities for them. So we're getting the email addresses right now, and we're reaching out to these folks, trying to get the ball rolling and get this tax legislation passed.
Good. Ken, it's been a great conversation. I'm Fred Haney. This is the Pitch Tips Zoomcast show, in which we have a conversation with a promising entrepreneur and see if we can help, because of our venture capital experience, see if we can help improve his chances of getting funding. Ken Eppens, has been great talking to you. Orbit Guardians is an incredibly ambitious project. Not going to be an easy thing to get funded, but you're doing a lot of the right things. I hope we can help you a little bit move that forward. Thank you very much for talking with us.
Thank you for your time, Fred. Appreciate it.